Hello everyone. Before we get started today, I wanted to take a moment to just sit and talk to you all directly. No one likes pre-roll ads, least of all me. Nobody likes clicking on a video only to have to sit through an unskippable advertisement for a product you're probably never going to buy. So you have my promise, here and now, that I will never directly monetize Dungeon of the Discarded through YouTube. No pre-roll ads, not ever. However, as much as I love making this show, getting my hands on all these old card games isn't free. So if you like what I'm doing here and want to help the show, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You can see my new videos there 3 days early, get your name in the credits at the end of the videos, and you can even request future games. All of that money will go right back into the production of the show so I can make new episodes bigger, better, and more often. If you can't afford to throw a few bucks my way though, that's fine too. Even just liking my videos, subscribing to my channel, and sharing it with people is a big help. Alright, on with the show. I'm really not looking forward to this one. In fact, I'm just going to put up my little rant warning now. Apply this to basically the entire video, because I'll tell you ahead of time, I have very few nice words to say about this particular game. It's that bad. Cue the title card. This is the part of the video where I talk about the history of the game, but that's going to be a bit difficult in this particular case. MSF High is a surprisingly expansive multimedia thing with multiple webcomics, a tabletop RPG, and of course this card game. So the history is a bit complicated, and I couldn't even find the exact dates for a lot of this stuff, because the original website disappeared several years ago, and the new site still has multiple unfinished pages, so a lot of that information is just gone entirely. I checked the Wayback Machine, but it didn't save very much of what I was looking for. Still, I'm gonna do the best I can here. MSF High is, to put it simply, a setting created by Joseph Fanning, aka Wraith. It started out with a webcomic titled High School Changed Me, written by Fanning and illustrated by a friend of his, whose name I've been unable to find, but who went by Pip online. The comic ran for 176 pages before Pip departed due to creative differences. Sometime after this, Fanning partnered with a new artist, Allison Decker. They originally planned to reboot High School Changed Me with Decker as the new artist, but ultimately created a new comic instead, MSF High. Several years later, another artist, for whom I've only been able to find the name Merlin Missingham, was brought on board to produce that reboot of the original comic, which, while a significant improvement over the original, only ran for 105 pages this time before, once again, the artist left due to, let's say, creative differences. Unfortunately for anyone who may be interested in reading it, both versions of High School Changed Me were lost along with the original website. It was not easy for me to find them. Meanwhile, the now central comic, MSF High, is still running to this day, with almost 400 pages as of this recording. At some point during all of this, a tabletop role-playing game was also published, as was a demo for a video game that was never completed. The RPG can still be found on lulu.com, but the video game demo appears to have also been lost along with the old site. While none of these things ever really took off, you can't question Fanning's determination. He seems to really love the setting he created, and he keeps trying to make it work. I can definitely respect that. And of course, in 2009, Fanning and Decker released the MSF High collectible card game. Well, calling it a collectible card game isn't really accurate. What they released was half a dozen starter decks sold in sets of 2. Another dozen decks came out the next year, and then in 2011 there were 4 more decks, this last batch illustrated by Merlin rather than Decker. None of these were sold in stores, by the way, only print on demand via a service called the Game Crafter. Wyvern lasted for 3 years, and Ophidian 2350 was pulled off the market after only a few months, but MSF High never even made it to retail to begin with. This game didn't so much die as it was never even really alive. In addition to the 22 starter decks, a proper booster set was planned and supposedly fully designed, but never actually released. So if there's no real collectible aspect to this game, why am I talking about it on this show? Well, it calls itself a collectible card game, and like I said, it was originally intended to actually be one. The name may be inaccurate, but that's good enough for me. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I used to be friends with Joseph Fanning, and accordingly, for a few years, I was pretty heavily involved in the now-defunct community forum that was on the old website. We didn't really part on the best of terms, to say the least, and no, I'm not going to get into it now. But don't worry, I'll do my best not to let my residual disdain for fanning affect my opinion of the card game. Not that it really matters, because this game stinks entirely on its own merits. The starter decks sell for $19 for each set of 2, and I am not willing to spend over $200 to collect all 11 sets. So for the purposes of this video, what I'm mainly going to cover is the original 6 decks, though I will also briefly touch upon one particular set from later that I happen to also have. As always, let's start with the quality of the physical product. Put simply, it's bad. The cards were really poorly cut, so everything is misaligned. On almost every card, the border is partially cut off on at least one side, while the opposite side has these ugly black lines that should have been cut off. The same is true on the backs, with the thickness of the border on each side varying from card to card. And in a TCG, the card backs are the one thing that absolutely needs to be completely uniform. The ink is really dark, too. It obscures details of the artwork, and sometimes even makes it really hard to make out the image at all. Look at this card. Look at that art. Can you tell me what the heck is even going on here? Because to me it just looks like a black void. Insert Spinal Tap quote here. That's not even getting into the artwork itself. Aside from a handful of cards credited to a Calvin Chow, it was all drawn by Decker, and you can tell how rushed she was with so many cards to illustrate. They're all boring medium or close-up shots that show barely anything of the character's situation, often with almost comically thick line work that prevents there from being much detail. The ugly triangular eyes on the characters are pretty distracting too, but credit where it's due, she did stop doing that on the later cards. Still, even at its best, the art reeks of early 2000s DeviantArt. And it's not just the artwork that suffers from this. The dark purple background on some cards makes the text really hard to read, and the Comic Sans-esque font just adds insult to injury. The one decent thing about the product is the cardstock, which is very nice and thick. Some of the nicest I've ever seen, actually. And I guess the flavor text isn't bad. Most of it's just lame attempts at jokes, but I'll admit that a few cards got a mild chuckle out of me. And there is one bit of flavor text that I honestly really love. It's without question the single best thing in this game. Ladies and gentlemen and others, I present to you the flavor text of the generic orc card. I love this. It's a shockingly clever meta-gag based on fantasy cliches, and even established lore within the webcomic. But even this has to be ruined by the lack of Oxford comma. Grammar may be a classist construct, but you can pry the Oxford comma out of my cold, dead, and lifeless hands. On the other hand, the flavor text can be a bit of a problem as well. In this particular font, the difference between the regular effect text and the italicized flavor text is pretty minor, so it can be a bit tricky at first glance to tell what's effect text and what's flavor text, which is a problem you should not be having. Either do more to differentiate the text, or put a line or something between them. Or remove the flavor text entirely, whatever. I also have to mention the one card I found where the flavor text was literally cut off, interrupted mid-sentence. I assume this was a mistake made when editing the card text that cut the bottom line out of the frame, but how do you not look back over and catch something like this before sending it off to print? I'm in awe. As for the packaging, there isn't any. No starter deck boxes with blurbs on the back, nothing. They just shipped in blank, generic boxes. So if you're a fan of the webcomic who is hoping to buy these and display them on a shelf or something, you're in for a rude awakening because there's nothing to display them in. The presentation is so thoroughly amateur that I'm almost insulted. I paid money for this. For your $19 plus shipping, you get 2 50-card decks, a single sheet with the rules, recreations of the face characters' student ID cards from the webcomic, and a few of these weird little things that seem to be intended to help you track hit points and other things, but how are you even supposed to use them? A dry erase marker won't erase, since this is just cardboard, so that doesn't work. There's very little room to write and cross things out with a pen, so that doesn't work. Maybe you're supposed to use a pencil with an eraser? I mean, I guess that might work, at least a few times before the crisscrossing pencil strokes leave so many grooves in the cardboard that it's impossible to write smoothly. I'm not one to complain about getting extra freebies with my starter decks, but what is even the point of these? Before we move on, I really need to talk about the rulebook, or I guess in this case, rules sheet. because it's all on this single sheet of paper with no illustrations, no diagrams, just a double-sided wall of text. Maybe this is cheaper to manufacture than a real rulebook, but it just looks really amateurish, like something made by a teenager as part of a school project. It wouldn't be that much of an issue if the rules weren't also poorly written. They read more like a friend trying to explain this cool game he came up with than they do an actual rulebook. Phrases like, "It's usually a good idea," "This will make more sense later," "This is fine," and "There's a reasonable possibility," while fine in an informal video tutorial or something, do not belong in the rulebook that ships with your game. And that's not even getting into places where the wording is circuitous and confusing, or even questionable grammatically. One of your still alive characters? Really? Let alone the gigantic holes in the rules. For instance, nowhere in the rules is it specified what happens when a player runs out of cards to draw. Which is a major problem because that particular possibility is far more likely here than in most card games that actually include a ruling on the subject. The written rules are the foundation of your game. Even the most ingenious mechanics don't mean anything if they aren't explained well, and these rules are written really poorly. That's already a bad sign, and I haven't even gotten into the actual mechanics yet. Alright, enough stalling. Let's get this over with. I swear I'm not doing this intentionally, but here we have another game where you start the match with your dudes on the board. In this game, you start with 5 level 1 character cards. Each character has hit points, an attack score, an ability, and flavor text. Oh, and I guess a gender and faction, but this information is not clearly communicated. The other stuff is obvious, but the gender and faction, which are important by the way, are denoted in honestly the dumbest way I can imagine. If the card has a blue border, well, the rules say blue, but it's really more of a purple, the character is male. Or if the border is pink, they're female. This technically means the gender binary is baked into the rules of the game. I don't want to derail this whole video with a lengthy digression, but suffice to say, this gets a yikes from me. There are also 7 different factions that a character can belong to, and this information is conveyed, get this, via a background gradient. Yes, really. This ugly purple and green background? Yeah, this means Victoria is part of the Galactic Anarchists. Was there really no better way to do this? I mean, I get that Magic has different background colors for its cards, but it also has mana symbols in the corner. And there's plenty of room here to add symbols for both faction and gender if you really want to. Here, I threw this together in 10 minutes. You're welcome. Look at this. Can you imagine trying to play this game if you're colorblind? It would not be very much fun. I mean, it isn't fun anyway, but you get my point. At least the other things you need to know here are relatively straightforward. The character's level is up here in the corner. All of your characters start at level 1, but level 2 versions exist for some of them. You are allowed to have more than 5 character cards, sticking the additional ones into your main deck, but you do need at least the minimum of 5 level 1 characters. Hit points and base attack should be self-explanatory, and then you have the ability and flavor text. As I mentioned in my Ophidian 2350 video, I love when a game gives names for character abilities, and that's another one of the few things that I do like about this one. And this is the last time in this video that you will hear me say anything positive about this game. The other 45 cards comprise your deck, and this will be a mix of additional character cards, spells, and items. Spell cards have an orange border, and they're mostly one-off effects, though some will remain on the board or attached to other cards. And just like character cards, the background gradient is relevant to these as well. In this case, they denote the spell's element. Again, how hard could it have been to just have element icons or something? Green borders denote item cards, which come in several types, once again differentiated by the background. It's slightly less terrible in this case, because the backgrounds are actual patterns and images rather than just colored gradients, but at the risk of repeating myself again, why couldn't there just be icons? Weapon cards equipped to characters and tend to increase their attack score. Armor cards also equip to characters, but generally reduce the damage they take. Typically, a character can only equip 1 weapon and 1 armor at a time, though the rules don't specify what to do if you want to equip a new weapon or armor to a character who already has one, yet another hole in the rules. Consumables are either one-off effects, or can only be used a certain number of times before they're discarded. And devices remain on the field, though you're limited to only 1 copy of any given device card in play at a time. There are also gray-bordered level-up cards that can power up your characters further, and violet-bordered location cards that affect both players in the same way, but none of the starter decks we played with had either of these, so I'm not going to go into them in detail. MSF High is actually pretty simple compared to the previous games I've covered on this channel, which makes it all the more surprising that it stinks so much. You'd think it would be difficult to screw up such a simple game, but somehow they found a way. At the start of the game, both players arrange their 5 level 1 characters in a horizontal line. Arrangement can be important, but only minimally so. Then they draw their starting hands. The first turn player draws 3 cards, while the second turn player draws 5. You would expect to draw a card at the start of your turn, but that's not actually how it works in MSF High. Instead, if you have fewer than 5 cards, you draw until you have 5. If you already have 5 or more cards in hand, you don't draw anything. I'll get into why this is such a major problem later, so just remember it for now. To play a character card, you need to already have a copy of that character in play, which means that if, say, Lionel isn't one of your starting 5 characters, you can't just drop him into your deck as an extra. When you play a character card that's the same level as a character already on the board, it acts as a full heal, restoring that character to full HP. But you can also play a level 2 card on top of the level 1 card for that character, thus leveling them up. When you do so, their HP and attack tend to increase, and they gain a new ability. They do still keep their old abilities, so you don't need to worry about replacing a good skill with a lesser one, and this too heals them completely. Level up cards are a more universal way to make your characters stronger. If the character meets any conditions that may be listed on the card, such as belonging to a certain faction, you can use the level up on them, and it acts in much the same way as a normal character card. The issue here is there are certain aspects to this mechanic that the rules don't clarify. It says that you can only use a character card if its level is equal to or higher than the character's current level, which means you can't use a level 1 card to heal a level 2 character, but it says nothing about how this interacts with the gray level up cards. A level up card raises the character's current level by 1, which means a level 1 character plus 1 level up card is considered level 2. But what happens if they have 2 level up cards and you want to play their level 2 character card? The card is level 2, but their current level is 3. Can you play the card since the base character is level 1 without the level ups, or are you screwed? It would be nice if this was clarified either way, but as usual, the rules sheet is no help at all. Spells and items work essentially the same way as one another. They each have a cost, a value, and an effect. When you play a spell or an item, the cost tells you how much magic or money you need to spend to play it. Spells cost magic, and items cost money. And you get these resources by discarding cards from your hand. When you discard a spell, you gain magic equal to its value, and when you discard an item, you gain its value in money. You can also discard a character card to gain its level in both money and magic. There are several problems with this system, but let's focus on the obvious one. Why the heck are there 2 separate currencies to begin with? Imagine playing Magic the Gathering, but in addition to having mana, half the cards instead cost something else, like, I don't know, Splana. Now imagine half your lands provide mana, and the other half provide Splana, and there's no way to convert one into the other. You'd find yourself getting mana screwed or Splana screwed constantly. It is depressingly common in MSF High to end up in a situation where you have exactly the spell you need in hand, but you can't play it because all of the other cards in your hand are items, meaning you have nothing to discard for magic, or vice versa. In the game I played, link in the description, we both found ourselves often tossing out much of our hands, not because we needed the resources, but just to get rid of the cards so we could draw more and hopefully get what we actually needed. And when your players are deliberately dumping a significant portion of their decks like this, that's a really bad sign. And this could have been so easily fixed by only having 1 currency instead of 2. Even just giving us some way to exchange one for the other would have alleviated so much frustration. As it is, the best solution is to just build a deck that has only items or only spells with none of the other type. Fix your crappy design. Don't force your players to find these lame workarounds to make your game playable. Another weird aspect to this game is that you're only allowed to play a maximum of 3 cards during your turn. 1 character or level up, 1 spell, and 1 item. In most games, you can play as many cards as you want if you have the resources to spend on them, so this is an odd thing to limit, and I don't understand why they would do so. In addition to your 3 cards, you also get 1 action. There are a couple of different things that you can do with this action, but you can only do 1 of them per turn. The most straightforward way to use your action is to just attack. You pick one of your characters and freeze them, which is exactly like tapping in Magic, and declare which of your opponent's characters will be the target. Your character deals damage equal to their current attack value, and that's about it. Sometimes there are card effects that can trigger here, but for the most part it's pretty basic. When a character's HP reaches 0, they're knocked out. They remain on the board, but they can no longer do anything. The first player to eliminate all of their opponent's characters wins. There's also a mechanic allowing two characters to team up to attack together. To do this, the characters need to be adjacent to one another, and they must belong to the same faction. So this is why placement can matter, like I said before. You also need to spend magic equal to their total combined levels. So for example, to have this level 1 character and this level 2 character attack together, I need to spend 3 magic. The thing is, there's never really any reason to do this. They just deal damage equal to their total combined attacks without any sort of bonus, so all you're really doing is spending magic to get off 2 attacks at the same time. And turns in this game are so short that it's really not a big deal to just wait until the next turn to have the second character attack. There's almost never any situation where that magic would not be better spent just casting a spell. Additionally, unaligned characters like Donovan here can't perform combo attacks at all, which would be a problem if combo attacks weren't so pointless in practice. This does, however, illuminate another hole in the rules. They never specify how knocking a character out affects placement. There's a card that lets you rearrange your guys in the middle of the game, and it says you can't move fallen characters, so one can assume they just stay there filling the space rather than being removed, but the rules sheet doesn't say for certain one way or the other. Back on topic, instead of attacking, you can also use your action to activate a character's ability. While some abilities are passive and will trigger automatically under certain conditions or in reaction to other things, many require you to use your action and freeze the character. Typically, it's not hard to tell which is which, but could it have hurt to add a little symbol or something to further differentiate these types of abilities? When it comes to mechanical text, there's really no such thing as too much clarity. There's one other way to use your action. Unlike in Magic, characters don't unfreeze automatically at the start of your turn. Instead, you can use your action to unfreeze all of your characters. This isn't a bad idea in concept, but in practice it just exacerbates the unstable equilibrium inherent to its structure. If you've seen my Wyvern video, you should already be familiar with this concept. But for a quick recap, the more of your opponent's characters you knock out, the less ability they have to fight back. Needing to spend an action to unfreeze your characters just increases the instability, because in addition to reducing their manpower, it also means they can get fewer attacks off before all of their characters are expended and they need to take a turn off to unfreeze them. Which means the player who's already at a disadvantage is just disadvantaged further by the need to spend more time refreshing the remaining troops, while their opponent can just keep attacking. Okay, so as you can already tell, there are a lot of problems with this game, but are the actual cards any good? Maybe some solid card design can make up for this game's faults and redeem it. You already know the answer. Unsurprisingly, the card design is terrible. There's a concept in card games called the power curve. I don't want to spend 20 minutes explaining what this means, but in simple terms, imagine a line on a graph showing the average power levels of each card in your game on axes charting their cost and power. Cards that fall well below the standard curve will be too weak to be worth using, while cards too high above it will overshadow everything else and potentially break your game completely. There can be some variation, but generally speaking, every card in your game should be within a reasonable distance of that line. The reason I bring this up is that every card in MSF High feels like it was designed in a vacuum, with no thought given to how it might interact with other cards, or even, yes, how it would fall on the power curve. A prime example of this is a series of cards that I have been calling the Did Anyone Double Check This basic weapon package. This consists of a series of 4 weapon cards which have the same effect, increasing the attack of the equipped character by 20 points. That's actually a decent effect, but when you take even 5 seconds to look at how these cards compare to one another, the amateur mistakes become immediately apparent. It should be obvious already that it's preferable to have cards with a low cost and a high value, since you need to spend less to play them and get more for tossing them out. If a card has a worse cost to value ratio but a stronger effect, then you naturally need to consider whether or not that effect is worth it, and maybe it is. But consider the possibility of 2 cards with different cost to value ratios, but the same effect. Of course you're going to want to use the one with the better ratio because it's just an outright better card, and you already know where I'm going with this. Shortsword and Longsword both give the aforementioned plus 20 attack, but while Longsword has a cost of 2 and a value of 2, Shortsword has a cost of only 1 and a value of 3, Short Sword has both a better cost and a better value than Long Sword for the exact same effect. On top of that, you also have Shining Sword, which aside from the name, is identical to Short Sword. Between the two of them, that's up to 8 cards in a 45 card deck, meaning there is no reason to ever use a Long Sword while these other two strictly better cards exist. You wanna know the worst part? These 3 cards all came in the Donovan and Urk starter set. Yeah, they shipped together. There was already no excuse for this, but shoving them all in the same box makes it especially blatant. I refuse to believe that no one noticed this before these cards went to print, so I'm forced to conclude that they just didn't care. Oh, but I said there were 4 cards, didn't I? Ilusha's starter deck contains 4 copies of a card called Vine Sword. This is identical to Long Sword, except it comes with the added restriction that you can only equip it to characters of a single specific faction. So, to recap, they took a card that was already pretty much unplayable, and they made it even worse. And remember, these decks released at the same time, so the comparisons naturally come immediately. Of course, that's far from the only case of terrible card balancing, but if I went through every one individually, this video would be several hours long. So let's move on to the next problem. Terrible card wording. It should go without saying that how you word your card text is vitally important. It's what your players are going to read in order to learn what the cards actually do. So of course, you need to do absolutely everything you possibly can to make sure that the text is as precise, accurate, and unambiguous as possible. It may just stem from several years of playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, a particularly complicated card game in which the text is written such that rules lawyering is basically required, but I like to think I'm pretty good about interpreting card text. MSF High is some of the most poorly written text I've ever seen, and I am including early Yu-Gi-Oh! When I say that. There are some cards here where I think I can see how they were intended to work, but that don't actually work that way in practice if you play them as written. I've even got 2 prime examples straight from the same starter deck, Werewolf and Nanako's Mahotech Pistol. Werewolf is the easier one to explain, so let's start there. As an action, you can freeze Werewolf to put 2 counters on it. And when it attacks, you remove a counter. And as long as it has a counter on it, its attacks deal 20 additional damage. Seems straightforward, right? When you use this ability, it gets a damage boost for 2 attacks. Except, based on the strictest, most rules-lawyery interpretation of the text, that's not actually what happens. The damage boost is only in effect while the counters are on the card. And since you remove a counter each time it attacks, that means the second counter disappears the instant you declare the second attack, and the damage bonus along with it. So in practice, Werewolf's ability only gives it a boost for 1 attack, not 2. And it would have been such an easy fix, too. All you'd need is a simple tweak, using the word after this character attacks instead. There, I fixed your card for you, Fanning. As for Nanako's Mahotech Pistol, this one's a bit more complicated, so strap in. This is a weapon that can only be equipped to Nanako. By default, it provides no bonuses, but you can spend 1 magic to put a counter on it up to a maximum of 5. Then, when Nanako attacks, she deals 10 extra damage for every counter on the pistol. And after the turn is over, you remove the counters. That's actually a neat idea. You can spend a couple turns pouring your magic into the gun to build up for a single big attack that expends it all. Except that's not actually what happens. Look at the last sentence here. Remove all tokens at the beginning of the next turn. Notice how the sentence is completely disconnected from anything about attacking. It's an independent clause. You remove the counters every turn regardless of whether you attack or not. It's certainly possible that this was intentional, that they only wanted to let you use the magic within the same turn, but then why bother with the counters at all? Why not just have it say something like, spend magic up to a maximum of 5 to increase the damage by 10 for each magic spent? Either way, it's a poorly made card, just one of many like it. And actually, these 2 cards I just talked about work as a fantastic segue to the next design problem. There is an almost obscene number of cards that use counters. Excuse me. Tokens. When this item comes into play, place a token on it. Select an enemy character and place a token on them. When this character comes into play, place 3 tokens on it. Place 2 tokens on this card. Place 3 tokens on a character with a ranged weapon. This card comes into play with 5 tokens. And that's just a few of them! Counters do have their place in a TCG. When a card remains in play for a specific number of turns, or can be used a limited number of times before it's discarded, they're an effective way to keep track of that. But good lord, this is excessive!
Some of these didn't even need to use counters. Something like Disposable Shield or Rock Crab could just as easily have been made to remain on the board until you choose to discard them for the effect, and that would have been so much simpler. Then there are a few cards that end up overpowered due to design oversights, typically in how they interact with some rule or lack thereof. For instance, Enchant Weapon and Enchant Armor. These two spells each have a cost of 1 and a value of 2, and they attach to a weapon or armor, increasing their damage or damage reduction by 10 respectively. Seems fine, except where the rules state that a character can only have one weapon or one armor equipped, they say nothing about stacking multiple enchantments on the same item. So you could theoretically accumulate a bunch of enchant weapon spells on a single weapon, and hell, let's throw in a couple of flaming weapon spells too for the hell of it, to raise a character's attack to such an absurd degree that they can one-shot their targets. Or how about stacking 3 enchant armor spells on a heavy armor, rendering the character virtually untouchable? Put this on a character with the ability to intercept attacks meant for other targets, like Nanako's mecha, and congratulations, you now have an insurmountable wall and have basically already won the game. I actually did this in the match I played earlier, by the way. Nanako's starter deck can pull off this particular move right out of the box.
Every problem in this game is so glaring. How do you manage to screw up this badly? But that actually illuminates another issue, and that's how poorly designed the actual starter decks are. You'd expect even a starter deck to have some kind of specific strategy to it, or at least a game mechanic that it focuses on utilizing. But aside from favoring a specific faction or the Rainier deck's heavy number of item cards, none of the starter decks I've looked at have any defined playstyle at all.
Every single one of them has a few cards that are highly situational, and not even in ways the deck in question can really capitalize on. It really makes me wonder if these were play-tested at all.
Actually, scratch that. I know they weren't play-tested. You want to know how I know? Let's look at the Simone and Hemlock set for a second.
They each contain a single copy of the spell card Overgrow. It's a 3-cost, 1-value spell that remains in play, and whenever an earth, fire, water, or light spell deals damage, Overgrow adds an extra 10 damage.
Guess how many spells these decks have that can benefit from Overgrow? Yes, you read that correctly. Both of the decks in this set include a card that neither of them can use. How does that even happen? This is a truly staggering level of incompetence.
And that's not even getting into the other problem card in these decks, which can only be played if you've already used 2 other specific cards on the same target. And no, neither deck contains any tutors that can apply to these cards. You could play 100 games with these decks and never be able to use this card.
I couldn't think of a good transition here, so let's just talk about card advantage. Now, this can be a difficult concept to grasp for someone who isn't well versed in card game strategy, so I'm just going to give the short version by quoting Wikipedia. Card advantage is a term used in collectible card game strategy to indicate one player having access to more cards than another player, usually by drawing more cards through in-game effects. The concept was first described early in the evolution of Magic the Gathering strategy, where many early decks relied on a player drawing more cards than their opponent, and then using this advantage to play more cards and advance their position faster than their opponent. By 2007, it was recognized as one of the most important indicators of who is ahead in a game, and has been utilized in the development of strategy for nearly every collectible card game created. Has been utilized in the development of strategy for nearly every collectible card game created. And this is a concept that MSF High completely ignores.
To keep this explanation simple, when calculating how a given play will affect card advantage, you look at how many cards you have before the play, and then how many cards you have after. Say you start with 5 cards. You play a single card that does a thing and then goes to the discard pile, and you've gone -1. You had 5, now you have 4. You may have gotten some big important effect from that card, but regardless, you've decreased your card advantage. But say that whatever card you play lets you draw 2 more cards. You've lost your first card, but gained 2. You had 5, now you have 6, which means that in this move you've gone +1.
This concept applies to almost every trading card game ever. Generally speaking, the more cards you have access to at one time, the better your position. If your number is higher than your opponent's, you're doing well. And any move that increases your number, or at least decreases your opponent's more than it does yours, is a good move. For those keeping score at home, this is why cards like Pot of Greed are so overpowered. A free, unconditional +1 is a little game-breaking. So what does this have to do with MSF High?
Well, because you're forced to discard cards from your hand to get the magic and money you need to play other cards, You will always go -1 at minimum for every move you make, even if the card you're playing stays on the board. It's outright impossible to get good card value from anything, and that's frustrating. But ultimately, it doesn't even matter. Since you're going to draw back up to 5 cards in your hand on your next turn anyway, no matter how much you go into the red on card advantage, you'll always return right back to where you started before long.
As a result, there's no real flow to the game, and the overall strategy is a lot more shallow. I realize that everything I just said in this segment may be complete gibberish to some of you, and for that I apologize. It's just something I had to mention because it's a specter that hangs over the entire game. So let's talk about something a bit more interesting, shall we? Because there are a couple of other weird things here that warrant mention.
Not all of the character cards are directly from the webcomic, or even original to the card game. Some of them are actually characters from the old play-by-post roleplay on the now-defunct community forum I mentioned way back at the beginning of the video. A few fans got to see their characters incorporated into the merch, which is actually kind of cool. Except not all of them are still fans. Mephis, one of the 5 character cards included in the Urk starter deck, belonged to a player who had a major falling out with Joseph Fanning years ago. I don't know what happened, but I do know that, as a result, Fanning altered all future printings of the set to remove Mephis, replacing him with a generic Orc card. And since these decks are print on demand, that means the only copies of the Mephis card in existence are the ones that went out before the change, which technically makes this the rarest trading card I own. Not that it's worth anything, because who would want it? Or at least I heard it was removed. Fanning told me that himself when he did it, but the card is still listed on the set's product page, and I'm not willing to buy another copy to find out for certain. Fanning and Decker also made a few additional starter decks that were released exclusively to Decker's DeviantArt page in a format allowing people to print them out themselves, which is interesting. They also used to take commissions for custom decks based on your own characters, but as far as I can confirm, only one person ever went for this. Even more bizarrely, 2 of the free decks were based on former members of Channel Awesome, the Spoony One and Linkara. This seems like an odd choice to me, but in a world where Geek Fight exists, what do I know? And it looks like they did start adding faction and type icons to the cards eventually. In 2011, after they had stopped making proper sets. So that's the MSF High collectible card game. What's the bottom line? Come on, what do you think? It's terrible! But you suffered through it with me this far, so you already knew that. It's creative, and I respect that they tried to do something different, but not one element of this game works. In every respect, it's an abject failure. Maybe someday Decker and Fanning will find a way to break into the mainstream, but this isn't it. Until the next time you pay me a visit, this is Craig bidding you farewell from the Dungeon of the Discarded. And Wraith, if you're watching this, I didn't do it out of spite for you or the fan base that you somehow still have. I did it because your game is garbage. There were cards all over the floor. Why did I do this?